everyone. Welcome back to Bookish. Happy New Year. I'm Laura Yu, and I'm here with my friends, Sylvia Lee and Kofi Adisa. So today we're going to be talking about a genre and talk about one specific example from that. We're going to be discussing graphic novels or graphic memoirs or graphic history. So just graphic literature, I guess. And when we were talking about, why graphic novel or which graphic novels, I realized that many of the graphic novels I've read were actually not novels, but memoirs or some kind of a historical telling of a story. So, and Sylvia remembered that she and I had read a graphic history when we were taking a history class together. And the book is called Abina and the Important Men, and it's a retelling of actually a court case from the late 19th century in current Ghana and Gold Coast, but I think it's currently is Ghana. So we'll be talking about graphic novels in general or graphic literature in general, and specifically about how this particular work about Abina works. So I'm going to go to Kofi next. So Kofi, what's been your experience with graphic literature, and why graphic literature, I guess, graphic novel or graphic memoir?
Yeah, I with Abina, it was the first time that I saw kind of a history that's dealing with the internal slavery that was happening in the 19th century in Ghana. That was different from, say, Mouse, which was a retelling of the Holocaust that featured mice as Jewish and cats as Germans. So it's still dealing with specific historical moments, but they've done totally differently. And so with Abina, it's sort of a composite of notes and some of the writings that were found, I guess, within the archives of in Britain. And this became sort of the catalyst for Trevor Gates, I think it is, or Getz, to put together this graphic history of this little known case where this Ghanaian woman argued for her freedom because she believed she was wrongly enslaved to another captor. So I found it just to be a fascinating telling or retelling in a graphical sense. The actual graphic portion isn't as long as some of the historical backgrounds to it. And, that was also interesting because with a lot of other graphic novels, usually if there is long writing, it's sort of interspersed throughout the pictorial of images, or it's sort of embedded within the actual story. So I found it to be fascinating in a variety of ways. What was your first reading of this? How did it strike you, Sylvia? I'm just curious.
I had a very similar kind of process as you, Kofi, just kind of thinking through it. And I thought it was so well done because, like you said, the actual graphic, like the illustrated story of what happens to Abina was very short and it's a quick read. But the real gold mine was sort of like all the context that the author provided, really about how history is written, right, and how that shapes the way we construct meaning. And so I really appreciated these considerations that the author was walking us through, like, right after the story or the graphic illustrated portion ends, he goes into this question of like, well, whose story is this? And, if I were just consuming the story of Abina and her trial, I would just say, well, it's Abina's story. But he really invites us to critically think about what he calls a staircase of voices in history, especially when certain histories are just never told, right? Like usually the histories of like famous important men, and more recently women, are told, but really the histories of nobodies or regular people are often overlooked, because the historians and the people who are telling the stories are making choices, and it's easy when there are voices that are silenced, right, and marginalized, like Abina's was. She had no power. So I thought it just really made me linger over the whole story itself, and kind of like go back to moments in the illustrated portion, because I felt it so keenly. It wasn't just about like, like the fact that she was wrongly, because at this time I think slavery is technically outlawed technically, but people, they're not really, they're finding ways around the law. And really her point was she wanted justice, right? Like she wanted to prove that she was being held as a slave, and she wanted the men who had put her in that position to be brought to justice. And the fact that some of them, that they lied on stand and were able to be found not guilty, more than anything, like she by that time was out of that situation. Like she was employed with a kind, employer who was also, I think, her lawyer, and like, she was making friends, she was living her life. But it wasn't about like her being safe. It was about her getting a sense of this sort of justice, her story being told, and of something that was wrong being rightfully punished. And so I thought that being sort of where the kind of story ended was really poignant, and then launching into this discussion about like, how is history written? Who writes history, and whose history, and how, and like there's layers, like the staircase of voices. The story itself is, based on primary sources, transcripts from the thing, but that in and of itself was written by a white British, judge who, or like a magistrate who, had his own certain cultural context, for writing, and you could see that in the transcript. So then it's another layer that's interpreted by the writer, and then another layer interpreted by the illustrator. And so it really made me look at a lot of the other things I read, histories, very differently. And like, how do I know whose history that is? And if you've ever been, sorry, I'm like going on and on, because there's obviously a lot to talk about and think about with this. But like, growing up, even as like, Korean, like Koreans, for example, have a bone to pick with historical accounts, especially when it came to their own annexation and colonization by other nations. And so this has been a kind of a question, I think, that I've been thinking about for a long time, about like, whose voices do we hear and whose voices do we not hear? So anyways, this is why I think it's really important to distinguish graphic novels from like graphic histories. And I'm really glad that this one calls itself a graphic history, because it's not a novel, it was meticulously crafted. And yet there are some elements that they probably had to like creatively, include in there, which they recognize. But how about you, Laura? I remember when we were starting to read this together for that class, you're like, what? This is pretty cool. And so I'm glad we're doing it. So what was your experience?
In the class, the professor actually didn't assign the graphic novel part or graphic history part. He assigned the essays that are surrounding that narrative, right? Because it was really to study history or how history is done. So I did also think about rereading it again, how the graphic part plays a role in representing this story. And I am not a good graphic novel reader person. I tend to just ignore the images, actually, because I'm just not experienced in reading with images. So I will like just read all the conversation or the narrative, and then I have to remind myself like, oh wait, like let's pause and take a look at the image that's here. So what was interesting is that what they have is that quote unquote transcript, and that they're building this whole graphic novel on. And then the illustrator had to do sort of external research to find out, to remotely accurately represent what Abina's village might have looked like, or what the courtroom might have looked like, or what kind of clothing the persons or the characters might be wearing. So I thought that was also interesting, that adding to this trying to do accurate visual representation of the story too. Another interesting thing about the graphic part too is it was a very kind of clear indication of which characters are African characters, right? Black characters, or which characters are the white characters, which I think if you were reading the transcript, you'd have to kind of remind yourself, like, oh, who is this person? Who is that person? But in the drawing, you can see the race, and you are very clearly seeing, especially with names that I'm not familiar with, who is a male character, for example, and who are the female characters. And I think those things being visually represented really added a different experience to learning about this story, frankly, that I had never known about, this particular time frame, or even this issue of ongoing slavery within certain places in Africa after Britain had outlawed or made slavery illegal. So, in the question about why graphic, I think it added those kind of elements for me. Which, as a history like textbook, would this have been dry to read? I don't know, right? But I was rereading it, and actually my kids were kind of walking around, and like one of them peered over my shoulder and said, "Oh, is that a graphic novel?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, is it good?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Can I read it?" I was like, "Sure." So I think that would be, it's a good, I don't know, like history teaching book as well, in addition to being a book about history or how we do history.
Yeah,
I
I do
agree.
wonder if, oh, sorry.
I was going to ask you a question, Kofi. So maybe this
Oh,
will
okay.
help. But there was one part of that, and kind of what you said, Laura, made me think of that question again. And it's where they talk about the purpose of this of history, really, in constructing meaning, right? Not just in kind of informing or recording or archiving or capturing events like this happened, but for the purpose. One reason for it is for the purpose of constructing meaning. And it made me think about the misconceptions, or maybe the limited understanding we have of history. One of my husband's relatives is a trained historian, and he was saying over our holiday gathering that history is not linear, and it's very, it's kind of an error to read history that way. And I thought the way that this was done, kind of inviting us to think about this story in our current context, was really interesting. My question to you, Kofi, was going to be, in what way did the text or the reading guide or the essays that followed it, do you think that it was kind of constructing meaning? And if so, what kind of meaning do you think it was asking us to construct or consider?
I think that's a very good question. And you're really smart to ask me. But I don't really have a answer. I may have a smart alecky answer, but I don't have a smart answer. I think that, yeah, I think what I found interesting was how there was these levels of intertextuality, how all these other things, all these texts referred back to another text that referred back to another text that had a sort of multiplicity of texts that undergird them. So, this notion of cultural slavery that was happening, and at the same time when there was an abolition, an abolishment of slavery amongst states, amongst countries. But you had this cultural thing going on that was sort of like an open secret. And then you have this transcript. So that's the visual part, right? So then you have this transcript of the actual case, which is, there was actually two women who were sort of arguing about their conditions. But that harkens back to a cultural phenomena or social cultural phenomena that is very different than the larger chattel slavery that was practiced in the United States and the type of slavery that was practiced in Britain and in France and in Germany as well. And so all of these different entities impact how this story comes to life in a way. And so these different essays, these different readings, these different ways of understanding the histories. I think your relative is right that it's not a linear thing. It's not a straight line. It's sort of like a web, and that there's these different pieces that connect in intricate ways and in sometimes in very weighted ways, because how Abina saw herself as a slave was pretty much predicated to the fact that she didn't have the rights to move. She didn't have rights to choose who her husband was. And even when she said she was married, she wasn't really, the person who she said was her husband was someone who also enslaved her. So it was just these levels of what, matrimony and body rights for women at that time, and even till this time, becomes a larger part of this web of, I guess, meaning, you can say. And I think meaning is always an approximation of something, maybe closer to truth. But it seems like these texts are talking to and about and around things that were happening in one historical context, but yet continue to happen in other contexts beyond that history, I would say. So that's how I looked at it. And the point I was going to say was, like, when it says a graphic history, it's almost like it's announcing to readers that it's not like what they would think, which is like with one of your sons said, Laura, is a graphic novel, because it's dealing with that textuality too, that when people see something visual and in a thick book, and it's not like your regular old Marvel or DC comic, and there's a lot of words to it, they'll think, oh, graphic novel. And that's where their narrative structure begins and ends. But to see it, and even that's how I thought of it until I looked again and said, oh yeah, it's a graphic history. I don't know if I could read it the way you all read it, starting with the sort of the textual information first and then looking at the illustrations. I think that would have reframed how I encountered the book. So I just read it straight through, did my due diligence as a reader, going from page to page. And then, but I think if I were a student reading this as a history, I might have jumped past the transcripts and read sort of the context around it. So I might have jumped around a bit. I don't know if that answered your question, by the way. I know I said absolutely a lot of words.
It was a great answer, Kofi. I think something that you pointed out, the idea of cultural slavery, and also, when I was reading the transcript, I found myself like really engrossed in the part of the transcript where they're arguing on trial, like whether or not she was actually a slave. And in my mind, I was like, look at them trying to like gaslighting her into thinking like, no, you were not a slave. But the way that you've described it is it's perfect, right? And this is sort of what the author says, that there's so many political, social, cultural contexts that are kind of at play at any given moment within even the exchanges that are happening, that you have to understand them. You have to kind of acknowledge them in order to really understand what the confusion may have been, or just the deception, or, even the gaslighting, like the idea that, the role of women, and like you said, their rights or lack thereof, may have that was a huge part of it as well, right? Like you can't just, these things don't exist in exclusion from each other. So I thought you described that really well. How about you, Laura?
The part about the court case really, being a question about what does it mean to be free, and how do you know if you're free and versus if you are a slave, right? So in the court, during the trial, questions like, were you called a slave, or were you given compensation for the work that you did? And the question about is food and cloth, are those things consider compensation? So in considering those questions, I think, it really very much was about kind of a philosophical question, like, what does it mean for an individual to be free? And one of the things that the authors do talk about in one of those sort of essays in the or reading guides is how, as a reader, I can't not think about my understanding of what is just or fair, or what does it even mean to be free, right? So I'm bringing my value system into sort of judging the trial that's happening, but that it's important to recognize that as a historian or as a reader, that we can't not bring that, right? We need to be aware of it, our presence in the reading practice, I guess. So I found that discussion about, well, how do you know you were a slave, to be just so fascinating. And I was kind of like dumbfounded, like, what do you mean? What do you mean that's not clear that she was a slave, right? But that I could also understand why and how in that context it was a question that was debatable, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it was also, even though the attorney for I think it's Edo or Adu, even though he was arguing this or asking these questions to Abina, it was really slanted to cause her to really doubt her own situation, for her to um, sort of undermine her own credibility, right? So that's kind of the role of the lawyer in a sense. But it did lend itself to, when does the person truly know when they are in
Mm-hmm.
bondage? And I kept wanting her to say, well, I didn't have the freedom to make choices. Choices are already made for me. I had to do work. I had to do the chores. I had no say in this. But I was also struck by, to sort of the point that you're making, Laura, that these are my 21st century ways of seeing things, and that in the late 19th century, yes, they probably in Ghana had terms for choice, but the way we think about it now is not the way they probably would have thought about it then, or maybe even if they did within that cultural context, to be a part of a conquered people, there was some established understanding that you were going to be subsumed by another system. So in that system, it was the Shanti, and then the Shanti fell to another group of people. And so when you have these different kinds of wars, there's a sort of psychology, and there's a sort of psychology of what you're going to experience. You're going to be captured, and you're going to have to do certain things for a period in time. But there's always there's this, it's not a veiled understanding, but there is definitely an understanding that if you are sold off, you're sold off. And the way this happened with her, it was so surreptitious, and she sort of put two and two together, and that became the contention point. For all she remembered and all she knows is that Yao Awa was her husband, even though he was basically another enslaver. And so that's the sort of layers that makes it complicated, I think, that makes the story complicated, but also makes it broader and makes us understand these different cultural norms at specific moments in history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
At least
that's why I think that's also why, like, it's hard to look at one of the characters whose transcript is one of the primary documents for this whole graphic history. Melton, who is kind of like the magistrate or the judge in the course. I mean, in the trial, the court trial. It's hard to even villainize Melton as like, oh, British colonists coming in and trying to make these decisions, and the author gives us an insight into Melton's upbringing and his training as well, right? And talks about how Melton was trained to believe that the British were the pinnacle of like moral superiority because they had also abolished slavery, and at the same time he was trying to balance that with respecting the cultural norms and the rules of the area that he was posted in, right? And not to kind of impose fully like the British way of doing things onto all their customs and practices. But to your point, Kofi, it's essentially cultural relativism, right? Like we're looking at what was considered the norm and appropriate during that time in that culture, and how the magistrate person was really trying to balance these things. So yeah, I think it was just a really heady reading of this graphic history. And to our listeners and viewers, we really recommend that you pick this up. I mean, it's a really just I think a really thought-provoking and quick read. I think, to your point, the fact that they did the graphic illustrated part first and then the essays, because usually you would see them like sort of flipped, but in like academic readers, it's in this particular order. I think really helps. It helps you get into the story, you get invested in what's happening, and you want to read more about it, So I thought that was a really good decision by the authors, the editors, whoever. So yeah, I would recommend that you, our readers, pick this up. It is a great sort of, read and very accessible, I thought, into some of the historical considerations. All right, Kofi, take us away.
Yeah, as always, it's great to be with you, ladies. And for those viewing and listening, you can catch us at Bookish, a casual book club, .podbean.com. You can also catch us in Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. You can also see us on YouTube, and we have our Facebook page. Please drop us a line, a comment, like and subscribe, because we like to know what our viewers and listeners think as well. Till anon, we will see you next month, I think. We have not decided what we're going to talk about, so we can't even predict. Oh, we got something in store for you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.